My name's Adam Wood. I'm Director of Studies of the ISS, and I'm here today with Samuel Charap, Dr. Sam Charap, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia, based in the Washington, D.C. office of the ISS. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, and the Minsk agreement. So Sam, I wonder if you could just kick off by describing to us the terms, the conditions, the provisions of the new Minsk agreement.
So there are 13 stipulations, and this was the agreement that was finalized on February 12th, which followed 16 hours of negotiations among 4 heads of state: Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France. And what's interesting about the substance is, although the details differ from the previous set of Minsk agreements, the ones that were signed in September of last year, they are broadly covering the same set of issues: ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weaponry, a political process within Ukraine that would lead to decentralization of authority, and eventual return of control of the border to Ukrainian authorities. But what's different this time around is that, first of all, the document puts a Ukrainian domestic political compromise at the center of the process. It's constitutional reform is supposed to occur by the end of the year. And that will be necessary for political stability in Ukraine in the long term, even if Russia withdraws tomorrow, and especially because Russia will not withdraw tomorrow. And the second key difference, is sequencing. The previous Minsk agreements sort of laid out a bunch of things that should happen without suggesting any order in which they might happen. And this agreement is most specific about the most controversial provisions. So, most importantly, that full control over the Russia-Ukraine border will not be returned to Kiev until the Ukrainian constitution is reformed.
So that's what is intended to happen. How does this all relate to what is actually happening on the ground now?
So one of the key flaws in the agreement was that there isn't an armistice line. There isn't a line agreed of control. There's a line from which two lines from which the sides have to withdraw heavy weaponry, but there isn't a sort of armistice line. And that manifested itself early on in a fight over a strategic rail and transit hub called Donbas. And that was clearly the subject of many hours of those 16 in Minsk, and no agreement was found on that. So essentially, it was a salient, government-controlled salient deep in rebel-held territory that appeared likely to fall one way or another, and it eventually did after the documents had been signed. And that was by any measure, a ceasefire violation. However, it seemed clear when the leaders came out of their negotiations that was likely to happen. So what's happened now is that with this major and important exception, the document has begun to be implemented. There's reports from the monitors on the ground and the participants involved that they've begun to withdraw heavy weaponry as of last week, and that's continued this week. And most of the fighting has stopped. So we are seeing some progress, which does suggest that some parties have an interest in making this work.
In terms of their essential strategic interests, how do you think Russia and Ukraine view this agreement, and how do you actually evaluate its success going forward?
So I think from Russia's perspective, it got a lot of what it's been seeking from the very beginning. At the concessions, particularly vis-a-vis Ukraine's domestic political makeup. Ukraine had to make a lot of significant concessions, and that makes this document, from now going forward to the end of the year, the most difficult piece will be making it work domestically in Ukraine. Poroshenko has to sell it to a public that is not only radicalized, but in certain cases armed. And that there have developed these, the state has lost to a certain degree the monopoly on the use of force with these appearance of volunteer battalions. So that is going to be a challenge in the short term for Ukraine to actually push through the major changes that they've signed up for. There are other flaws. The monitoring mission of the OSCE are civilian monitors with notebooks. They're not military personnel with military equipment who are military professionals who normally comprise a peacekeeping force. And I think that limits their effectiveness in terms of monitoring and making the withdrawal work. In the longer term, the domestic political compromise actually contained within the agreement is terra incognita for Ukrainian domestic politics. So we just don't know how this country will work when you have two sort of hyper-empowered Russophile regions, and the rest of the country is still governed like it used to be, i.e. highly centralized with a lot of with Kiev having control essentially over everything, down to appointment of election commissioners in local districts. So we should be concerned, or we should be prepared as much for the agreement to succeed as for it to fail, because that poses challenges in itself.
Now, as I mentioned before, you're based in Washington. How do you characterize current American policy debates on Russia and Ukraine? What's the atmosphere like there, and what's the direction of travel?
So it's an interesting question. In a way, the U.S. has sort of outsourced a lot of the negotiating on this and delegated to the EU broadly, but more specifically to Chancellor Angela Merkel, who really had the lead. And I think President Obama is very willing to let her take the lead and take this problem off his desk. There is growing momentum in the broader political establishment in Washington, it seems, to provide lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. A lot of debate around that. It doesn't seem to me that the president is sold on that idea, and I think the potential success of the Minsk agreement gives him reason to avoid taking that decision. But in the broader picture, I think there's a sense that we're sort of setting in for a long period of conflict, confrontation, adversarial relations with Russia that there's nothing much the U.S. could do to avoid. So sort of gloomy fatalism.
Very Russian in many ways.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, Sam, thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.